In the units, improved the focus location with 2.411 focus not obscured minimum and improved the location with 2.412 focus not obscured enhanced, I introduced the 2.411 and 2.412 criteria to support keyboard users and users with cognitive impairment. The persona of Julie, who experienced limited movement in her dominant hand, helped ground the requirement to a real person's needs, and this was followed by the technique to meet this criterion. In this case, avoiding sticky content such as header, footer or any kind of floating content unless it's coded to constrain the keyboard focus. The AA criterion allowed partially obscured interactive elements, whereas the AAA criterion did not. In the unit Enhance the focus location with 2.413 focus appearance, I introduced the 2.4.13 criterion to support keyboard users and users with cognitive impairment, and this is a AAA criterion. Madhu was the persona introduced, and he was a user who experienced deteriorating eyesight due to glaucoma. The technique to meet this requirement was to use a solid outline around the component, with the outline being at least 2 pixels thick on all sides, and ensure a colour contrast ratio of 3:1 between the same pixels when focused and unfocused. In the unit Replace dragging interactions with 2.5.7 dragging movements, I introduced a 2.5.7 criterion to support users with reduced fine motor control. The persona of Susan was introduced, who uses a head wand to navigate on-screen content due to being quadriplegic. The technique I discussed to meet this criterion was to not just provide a button alternative, but to provide buttons or a text input control, since the action of dragging needs to have an accessible alternative. In the unit Increase the target size with 2.5.8 target size minimum, I introduced the 2.5.8 criterion to support users with imprecise or unsteady pointer mobility. The persona of Alex, who has cerebral palsy, was introduced to help us ground the requirement to a real person's needs. The technique I discussed to meet this criterion was ensure target sizes are a minimum of 24 by 24 pixels, and where they are undersized, so less than 24 pixels, ensure the target and any guttering are at a minimum of 24 pixels. In the unit Create Help Consistency with 3.2.6 Consistent Help, I introduced the 3.2.6 criterion to support users with cognition and memory impairment. I chose the persona of Elliot, a young adult with autism, as a user who would benefit from the inclusion of this criterion. The technique I discussed to meet this criterion was ensuring a consistent location for help. This criterion is not about providing help, only that if global help is provided, then its location must be consistent. In the unit Reuse Existing Information with 3.3.7 Redundant Entry, I introduced a 3.3.7 criterion to support users with cognitive and memory impairments. The persona of Rashmi was introduced, an elderly, eager adopter of modern technology, but one who finds during the day her memory and focus declines, as someone who would benefit from the inclusion of this criterion. The technique I discussed to meet this criterion was ensuring previously entered information was available to be selected. This could be achieved any number of ways, including a checkbox to pre-select previously entered information, a drop-down list, or even displaying previously entered information to be copied. In the units, develop accessible identification with 3.3.8 accessible authentication minimum and develop accessible identification with 3.3.9 accessible authentication enhanced, I introduced the criteria 3.3.8 and 3.3.9 to support users with a cognitive impairment. The persona of Sam, who had a traumatic brain injury, was introduced as someone who would benefit from this criterion. The technique I discussed to meet these criteria were functionally the same. Ensure copy and paste is allowed in the username and password entry fields, and that the username and password entry fields have the correct autocomplete values, and a user is not required to remember any character sequences. Most of the new criteria are at the single A and AA level. For organisations that have accessibility policies, AA criteria, which includes the single A criteria, are those you should begin applying in anticipation of internal policy changes to the new WCAG version. The 3 AAA criteria could be considered as reach goals. Understand if they can be achieved without significant impact to the project delivery. Whilst adding more AAA criteria is a great goal, it shouldn't come at the expense of the double and single A criteria, as these are the baseline requirements that must be implemented.